You're listening to Psychiatry Rewritten, a show about what happens when we look beyond the checkbox. I'm your host, Lane, a psychiatric nurse practitioner and a fierce believer in gray areas. And in this episode, we're talking about something that's changed everything for me and for so many of my clients. ADHD, trauma, and what happens when no one ever thought to put them together. I used to think I was just careless, sloppy, irresponsible, unorganized, the kind of person who couldn't get their act together no matter how hard they tried. I'd lose my keys 3 times in the same morning, start 6 tasks, and finish none. Get told I was too intense, too scattered, too sensitive, too much. I'd say the wrong thing in a group of people and replay it for days in my head, obsess over it. Wonder if I was annoying, embarrassing, just too much for people to deal with. And I couldn't focus unless I was panicking. And when I did finally get something done, it was usually at 2 a.m., with shame gnawing at me harder than any deadline ever could have. I thought it was me. I thought I was lazy, selfish, dramatic. I thought I was a failure who just needed to try harder. But it didn't matter how hard I tried. And it just felt like I was still bad at life. But then something clicked. Someone asked a different question. Not, what's wrong with you? But what happened to you and how have you been surviving it? How have you been coping with it? And for the first time, it wasn't about failure. It was about a pattern. And pattern, I could work with. That story might sound familiar to you. I think those first-person stories are powerful and resonate with people because they are raw and it almost provides an example of an internal dialogue that somebody who experiences those kind of symptoms and feelings actually has in their head. And it might not sound familiar to you word for word, but in feeling. The spiral of self-blame. The shame that shows up when your brain just won't do what it's supposed to do. The way you start to think, maybe I really am just bad at this, at life, at being a person. In this episode, we're going to talk about the space where ADHD and trauma meet, and the people who've spent years thinking they were just too much or not enough. We'll talk about what gets missed, why it gets missed, and how everything starts to change when we finally ask the right questions. Because once you see the pattern, you start to realize it was never about failure. It was survival. And you've been doing the best you could with a brain that was wired for protection, not perfection. people think about ADHD, they picture a little boy bouncing off walls, not a grown woman with 3 planners and a shame spiral. They don't picture the quiet kid who zones out, daydreams, or forgets everything. They don't picture the adult who's been masking so hard for so long, they don't even know who they are when it's quiet. And they definitely don't picture trauma. But trauma and ADHD are linked in ways most clinicians were never trained to see. ADHD affects executive function, such as memory, planning, emotional regulation. Trauma affects nervous system regulation, things like hypervigilance, reactivity, dissociation, think your fight or flight response. Together, they create this perfect storm where you're stuck between panic and shutdown. You're overwhelmed, but expected to function, even when you feel paralyzed sometimes. And when that doesn't happen, when you don't function, you're labeled lazy, difficult, unmotivated. The truth, you are surviving. The research is crystal clear. ADHD in women, in BIPOC people, in LGBTQ+ individuals is wildly underdiagnosed. Why? Because the presentation doesn't look like what we were taught in our textbooks. It looks like anxiety, depression, mood swings, trauma response, personality disorder. And if we don't ask the right questions, we miss it. We medicate the wrong thing. We judge someone's behavior. And sometimes we blame them for not trying hard enough. I've had patients cry, not because they were diagnosed, but because for the first time, someone saw the full picture. One of them looked at me and said, "So it wasn't just me. I wasn't just messing up over and over for no reason?" And I told them, no, you were trying the best you could with a brain that no one ever helped you understand. Here's something that doesn't get said enough. Trauma can literally cause ADHD symptoms. And this isn't just a theory. We've seen it backed by research. Studies show that trauma, especially in childhood, can literally reshape attention pathways in the brain. Kids exposed to complex trauma often develop symptoms that look exactly like ADHD. Inattention, impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, even when ADHD wasn't there to begin with. Bessel van der Kolk writes about this in The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma changes how the brain filters information. It becomes reactive instead of reflective. It scans for threat instead of staying focused. Clinicians like Ford and van der Kolk have shown that trauma-exposed children frequently meet criteria for ADHD, not because they have a neurodevelopmental disorder, but because their nervous systems are in a constant state of hyperarousal. One study even found that kids with trauma histories showed impaired executive function that mirrored ADHD on standardized measures. That's how easily we can misread survival as pathology. When a child grows up in a state of chronic stress, whether it's chaos at home, emotional neglect, or survival-based parenting, their brain adapts. But those adaptations come with a cost. The brain learns to scan for danger instead of details. It becomes reactive instead of reflective. It struggles to filter out irrelevant stimuli because it was trained to notice everything. And over time, those trauma-shaped survival skills, they can look exactly like ADHD. There's another thing we need to talk about. Masking. A word that gets thrown around a lot, but not always understood. So let's talk about it. Masking is what happens when you spend your entire life performing a version of yourself that's more acceptable to the world, to society, to your peers, to your family, to everybody, even if it's completely misaligned with what's actually happening inside of you. It's smiling when your brain is screaming. It's saying, I'm fine. Because you've learned that people don't stick around when you're not. It's copying other people's behavior so you can pass as normal. It's exhausting. And for a lot of people, especially those with undiagnosed ADHD, autism, or trauma, masking becomes automatic. You become a master of mimicking focus, mimicking calm, mimicking connection. But inside, you're dysregulated, overstimulated, drowning. And the world says, you seem fine. That's what makes masking so dangerous. It hides the struggle, which means the support never comes. I've worked with and personally known so many people who told me they were high achieving, well-liked, and functional. But at night, they'd melt down, cry in the shower, numb out with food or alcohol, freeze when the smallest thing went wrong. And no one knew because they were masking all day, every day. And they thought it was just them. But it wasn't. This is a quote. I wasn't high functioning. I was high masking. And no one knew the difference. I'm not saying diagnose diagnosis is everything. It isn't a cure. It's not an identity. But for a lot of us, it's a mirror. It's the moment we stop fighting ourselves and start understanding why things felt so hard for so long. That's not a weakness. That's clarity. And clarity is where healing starts. When someone finally put the words ADHD and trauma in front of me, things started to make sense. My overwhelm wasn't failure. My sensitivity wasn't weakness. My inconsistency wasn't laziness. It was all part of a brain that learned how to survive before it ever had the chance to thrive. And I need to say something clearly, because this doesn't get said enough. Trauma doesn't just mimic ADHD. It can create it. Chronic trauma, especially in childhood, literally reshapes the brain. When a child grows up in a home where they never feel safe, where they have to stay hyper aware of moods, tones, footsteps, silence, their brain adapts. It gets faster at scanning for danger, faster than solving math problems. It prioritizes survival, not structure, not stability. And those adaptations, difficulty concentrating, racing thoughts, impulsivity, emotional outbursts, trouble following directions, forgetfulness. That's not a disorder. That's a nervous system doing its job in an unsafe environment. But when no one looks deeper, it gets labeled as ADHD. And maybe it is. Or maybe it's trauma, still echoing through the circuitry of a brain that learned how to survive, but was never taught how to feel safe. That's not a disorder. That's a nervous system doing its job in an unsafe environment. If you're wondering whether this might be you, there are screening tools, support groups, trauma-informed clinicians, and communities who get it. I'll link a few in the show notes. And if you've never felt seen in a diagnosis before, know this. Sometimes clarity doesn't just name the pain, it names the way through. If any part of this felt familiar, I want you to know something. You are not broken. You are not a mess. You are a human being who was never given the right language for what you've been living through. And I hope, if nothing else, this episode helps you look at yourself a little more gently. I hope it helps you to be kinder, not only to yourself, but also to the people around you. Because maybe it wasn't you. Maybe it wasn't them. Maybe it was the system, the silence, the assumptions, the shame. Maybe all you ever needed was for someone to ask the right questions. I'm not saying diagnosis is everything. It isn't a cure. It's not an identity. But for a lot of us, it's a mirror. It's the moment we stop fighting ourselves and start understanding why things felt so hard for so long. That's not a weakness. That's clarity. And clarity is where healing starts. When someone finally put the words ADHD and trauma in front of me, things started to make sense. My overwhelm wasn't failure. My sensitivity wasn't weakness. My inconsistency wasn't laziness. It was all part of a brain that learned how to survive before it ever had the chance to thrive. Here's what we know. ADHD isn't just a childhood disorder. And trauma isn't just something that happens during a crisis. Both of them can shape the way the brain develops. Both can affect how you process information, how you regulate emotions, how you manage time, how you respond to the world around you. But here's the part most people, even clinicians, don't realize. ADHD and trauma don't just coexist. They interact. They can mimic each other, mask each other, and most of the time, they make each other worse. So let's break it down further. ADHD affects your executive function. That's your brain's ability to organize, plan, shift focus, and regulate emotion. Trauma affects your nervous system, pushing you into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Now imagine both happening at once. You're overwhelmed by your environment and your thoughts. You're trying to regulate a system that's never had a stable rhythm to begin with. You're stuck in panic, scattered thinking, emotional dysregulation, and instead of help, you get told to calm down, try harder, be more disciplined. But how do you stay calm in a system that never learned how? And here's what that might look like in real life. You're called lazy because your brain shuts down when you're overstimulated. You're labeled dramatic because your emotional responses are intense and fast. You're seen as unmotivated because you can't start tasks unless there's urgency or fear or high stakes involved. You're told to be more consistent. But your brain literally isn't built for that kind of rhythm. You try to plan, but the planner becomes another thing you feel guilty about. That's not dysfunction. That's your brain doing its best with the wiring it has, with the wiring it is equipped with. Especially if trauma shaped it early. And here's the kicker. Research shows that people with childhood trauma are significantly more likely to exhibit symptoms that look like ADHD, even if they don't meet the full criteria, meaning even if they don't fit inside that check box. But for many, both are present. And when we only treat the trauma or only treat the ADHD, something still feels off. Because it's not one or the other. It's both. It's the gray area. And until someone names both, it can feel like nothing quite fits. I've seen it over and over in my clinical work and in my personal life. People who have carried shame for decades, who were punished in school, misunderstood in relationships, hard on themselves in therapy and in life. People who say things like, I didn't think ADHD could look like me. And the truth is, it often doesn't. Because the ADHD that gets recognized is loud, obvious, external. But the ADHD that gets missed, it's internal, hidden, masked by perfectionism, anxiety, overachievement, or shutdown. And if no one ever asked about trauma, I might not even be sitting here talking about it. And if no one ever asked about trauma, the diagnosis either never happens or it's delivered without the compassion it deserves. And that matters. Because a label without understanding is just another way to feel broken and lost. So no, diagnosis doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase the past. It won't undo the years you spent wondering what was wrong with you, or the time that you spent wondering, or the damage that wondering caused. But sometimes, diagnosis is where the bleeding finally stops. It's not a cure, but it's a mirror. A moment where the chaos finally lines up into a picture. It becomes something manageable. And for some of us, it's the first time we've ever seen ourselves clearly, without judgment. Often when I work with patients who receive an ADHD diagnosis later in life, especially women people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, or anyone who's lived in survival mode, I often hear the same type of reaction. Why didn't anyone catch this sooner? How different could my life have been? I just thought I was bad at everything. And sometimes I feel relieved, but also angry. And that's valid. Because grief is part of this process too. Because when the diagnosis finally makes sense, it shows you just how long you've been trying to live without the right tools. You start looking back at old report cards, old relationships, old friendships, old versions of yourself. I used to think ADHD and trauma were totally separate things. But once I started reading the work of people like Szymanski, Carrion, and Kolk, it changed everything. It made sense why so many of my clients were bouncing between diagnoses, medication, and shame. Because no one ever told them that trauma can look like ADHD. Or worse, that trauma can actually create ADHD symptoms in a developing brain. So if you've ever felt like you were constantly falling behind, forgetting things you were sure you wouldn't, losing focus until the deadline was a crisis, if your life has felt like an endless apology tour for being late, being loud, being inconsistent, being too much, you're not lazy. You're not too much. You are a person with a brain that was never supported the way it needed to be. And if you've also lived through trauma, then your brain was never given time to rest either. You were surviving in a world that kept asking you to perform when what you really needed was compassion. There's nothing wrong with needing structure, or clarity, or accommodations, or a different kind of support. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you self-aware. And I promise you, there is nothing wrong with your desire to understand yourself. Because once you do, you stop fighting your brain and you start working with it. That is going to be another topic I will discuss soon, which is just ADHD being the elephant in the room, essentially, and just deep diving into that topic. And honestly, whether you have a diagnosis or not, you deserve to know that your struggles weren't your fault. They were signals. And now, you have the chance to listen. And no, I'm not just going to discuss ADHD. I want to discuss every single topic in mental health, in psychiatry, that is pertinent to our to our society today. I want to discuss and challenge all the common and uncommon misconceptions. I want to talk about how the history of mental health shaped the way that we see it today. And I just most importantly want to have a more open dialogue about mental health and psychiatry by providing those first person point of view stories that really emphasize the kind of feelings and thoughts that people have and go through whenever they are struggling with mental health or just grief or a crisis. So yeah, I'm excited to share my experience and my education and my knowledge and just my passion, most importantly, for mental health and psychiatry with everybody that chooses to listen to this and takes time to listen to it. So thank you. You've been listening to Psychiatry Rewritten, The Gray Area. And in case no one's ever told you this, you're not broken. You were never too much. You just needed to be asked the right questions and given the opportunity to be your best self. And we'll end with one last closing quote for this episode. It wasn't just anxiety. It was ADHD. It was trauma. And no one had ever asked what it felt like inside my head. Thanks for being here, and we're just getting started.